So thank you very much for the invitation to return to my alma mater. When I was here at Penn, this was not here. This was an elementary school. And I went to the Newman Penn Center when it was right there under that brand new building that is basically a residence. And I did my, my undergraduate degree here in bioengineering. Spent many hours in the town building doing problem sets. I spent the first 2 years at Hill House. So I was just walking around today. It was nice to return. And back then, if you told me that I would come back as a Dominican priest, I would have told you you were crazy. That's why it surprises me how God's providence works. So today I'm going to be talking about death. And I'm going to be talking about the controversies surrounding the definition of death. Now, I've spent the last 2.5 years in the global south, in my homeland, in the Philippines, basically preparing the Philippines for the next pandemic. And working and living in a developing country has really changed the way that I see so many things that I used to think about here. So for example, organ donations is pretty much non-existent in the Philippines. So last year in the entire country, there were only 51 kidney transplantations in a country of 118 million people. So the kind of questions we're dealing with here don't really apply yet to the Philippines. But what I hope you will come to see is that how we work it out here in the global north is going to have a profound impact on how the rest of the world looks at death. So even though we are talking about death today in a technological age, I wanted to highlight that this is not a new problem. So I found this book published in 1746 on the online library of the Library of Congress, and it's The Uncertainty of the Signs of Death. And it's an incredible book where they go through and they try to figure out, well, cutting edge ways to figure out if someone is dead. So for example, they'd put a glass of water on your chest and they'd look at the level of the water to see if there was any residual breathing whatsoever. This is 1746 because it turned out there was a lot of people who were really terrified of being buried alive, right? And so this was the cause for this book. So today we're not really talking about people who are going to be buried alive. We're actually talking about organ donation and the context of organ donation. I want you to appreciate that that's really where we are today. And we're going to go through this lecture in the following way. We're going to begin with death. This is a philosophical account of death. And what I hope to highlight is that for many years, until very recently, there was really a consensus, both from the Catholic side and the secular side, as to what constituted death, even though the explanations for how to explain the disintegration of the body may have been different. We will then talk about total brain death, which is the account of brain death here in the United States. We're going to focus on the ongoing controversy over total brain death, and then we're going to explore different avenues for moving forward in this very controversial but very important public controversy, dispute. So we begin with death. So I'm going to talk about the classical philosophical criteria for death, and I'm going to highlight a talk given by Pope St. John Paul II to the 18th International Congress of the Transplantation Society at the turn of the millennium. And I want you to see how he describes death. And even though, of course, this is the Catholic Church speaking, the Catholic Church, when she talks about death, is not talking about a theological phenomenon, but a philosophical one. So death of the person is a single event consisting in the total disintegration of that unitary and integrated whole that is the personal self. I want to highlight the word disintegration, and I want to highlight the word integration. And so you're going to see that for the Catholic tradition, death is intimately related to integration. And I'm going to suggest to you, I'm going to show you why this is the case. And I'm going to show you that this is actually, it has been a shared consensus with the secular bioethical tradition for a while. And where does this come from? It results from the separation of the life principle or soul from the corporeal reality, the body of the person. And then this is the sign of that the individual organism has lost its integrative capacity. So if death is the separation of the soul from the body, we must first ask, what is the soul? Now, I teach at a Catholic university. We have 47,000 students at the University of Santo Tomas. It's one of the largest universities. It is the largest university in the Philippines. We have 26 different colleges. And 4 presidents of the Philippines are alum of our university. So it's a storied university. And when I give my talk on this, on philosophy of nature, what you find is that a lot of people have images of the soul that pretty much don't necessarily come from the Catholic tradition, but from the Cartesian tradition. So you've got this spirit inside the body, and this spirit is somehow driving the body. So when I define soul, I usually begin by showing them a pen. Hopefully I have a pen here. I don't have a pen. Well, it's really easy. I'm going to see if I have something that I can. All right, so I'm going to have this piece of paper. And if I ask you the question, why did that fall? What's the answer that you're going to give? Gravity. And if I ask you, what is gravity? Well, you're just going to say, ugh. And in fact, from talking to the physicist, I know that one of the fundamental challenges of modern physics in their attempt to really synthesize all the forces is that we really don't understand what gravity is about. But gravity is basically an explanation for this. So if you want to ask soul, you have to ask, why is he alive? And the answer is soul. Why is this chair dead? Because it has no soul. So soul is explanation for life, the activities of life, in the same way that gravity is the explanation for the falling motion of things that you see on this planet. Now, it's the principle of life. This is the philosophical, to get more precise. It's also the principle of organization, unity, and bodily integrity. What does that mean in English? It means this. How do I know that this is part of me? Because this has my soul. And this is a philosophical account, right? And it's interesting because when you have Siamese twins and you're trying to figure out who is where, you're going to be actually talking about the spatial relationships of their souls. That's how you would look at it philosophically. So in the Aristotelian Thomistic theory of substantial form, and the Catholic moral tradition comes from this, the soul is the cause of an organism. It is a reason for why this organism is alive. So kangaroos have kangaroo souls. Yeast, so I'm a yeast molecular biologist, yeast have yeast souls. So every living thing has a soul of a specific type, and it's that soul that determines the kind of thing that living organism is. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a principle of unity, integrity, and organization. Now, you notice, since the soul is the cause of the body's integration, the soul is what puts the body together. When you get rid of the soul, when you lose the soul, the body falls apart. And so what you see here is that when you talk about death, if classically understood, death is loss of the soul, then death is loss of integration. And so a body disintegrates. That's decomposition. That's what we talk about when we speak about a corpse. Now, I want to highlight that this is why the classic account of death, in terms of looking for a marker for death, for a sign of death, is going to look for the disintegration of the body. Now, when we move to loss of bodily integration, what I want to highlight is that this is not just a religious idea. Because if you look at the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine Defining Death, this is a very important document published in 1981, and we're going to return to it later in the lecture. What you're going to see is that the definition of death given by the President's Commission in 1981 is that death is that moment at which the body's physiological system ceases to constitute an integrated whole. So you see both the religious as well as the secular traditions have a common shared account of death. It's intimately linked to disintegration of a formerly integrated organism. So now we're going to move to total brain death. And if you talk about total brain death, we just have to review the brain, right? Some of you here are neurologists, neurobiologists. You know this a lot better than I do. I just want to highlight that the brain has multiple regions. And you've got two major parts in this debate. You've got the total brain itself, and then you've got the brain stem. And the brain stem is the most primitive part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that regulates, in a sense, the most rudimentary functions of living. So you've got breathing, blood pressure, heartbeat, swallowing, alertness, body temperature, and digestion. The brain stem is the part of the brain that's responsible for controlling that in your body. Now, in the United States and in most of the world, when we're talking about brain death, we're talking about failure of the whole brain. Now, in the UK, you're dealing with failure of the brain stem alone. And we're not going to be talking about this debate. So there's a debate here between whether or not brain death should constitute death of the failure of the entire organ, or simply one part, the part that is responsible for the most rudimentary functions of the human body. We're going to focus here again on the whole brain death criterion, which is held here in the United States and elsewhere. So you've got criteria. You've got a definition of death. Death is the failure of the function of the total brain. Medically, you need to have tests to determine if this actually has happened. And so you've got these tests, and basically the idea here is it's loss of some basic reflexes. And I'm not going to go into the biology and the medicine of it. I just want to highlight there are clinical tests associated with this, and you have to pass these tests in order to be declared brain dead. You also have imaging of the brain, and so on the very top, what you see here is that you're able to image blood flowing through the brain. And when blood is flowing through the brain, the image lights up. So the very top row, you've got brain death. You've got an individual whose brain is basically dead. There is no blood flow. You don't see significant lighting up of the image. On the lower part of the image, you've got a control. This is a healthy person, and you see there's many portions of his brain are lit up, and that's because blood is coursing through that brain. And so you've got both physiological tests, and you also have imaging tests in order to determine if someone is brain dead. Now, I want to put brain death in the context of other disorders of consciousness, because you may not realize that, for example, locked-in syndrome, these are other disorders of consciousness that are often dealt with by bioethicists, but they are distinct from total brain death. So here you've got a chart. On the vertical axis, you have awareness. So the lower you are, the less aware you are. Hopefully, most of you are on the top, where it says more aware. Okay? Now, on the horizontal axis, you've got arousal. You have awakeness. So you've got awareness and awakeness. Now, for those of us who are conscious and awake, we're basically in the upper right-hand quadrant. You have conscious, awake. And then as you fall asleep, what's happening is you're moving down the diagonal. So you become less aware and you become less awake. Now, you've got multiple physiological conditions that give rise to individuals at different points on this graph. So, for example, right there, less aware, less awake, you have individuals who are either in surgery under general anesthesia or they're in a coma. So they're just not awake, they're not aware. Now down here you have the vegetative state. You have individuals who are awake but are not aware. These are individuals, and I've had to, when I was a student brother, a third-year seminarian in the Order of Preachers, I spent 2 months caring for an individual in the persistent vegetative state. So she'd wake up in the morning. When it's time to wake up, she'd wake up, but she was not aware. You would talk to her, you would sing. She would simply be awake but not aware. When the sun set, she would go back to sleep. Now, what's really striking is there were some very fundamental, basic. So on Friday, I got to feed her ice cream. The rest of the time, she was on a peg tube, but she loved lime sherbet. And the sisters knew this. These were the Hawthorne Dominican sisters. So I would feed her lime sherbet every Friday afternoon. You'd put them on her lips, but she'd be just, if you talk to her, there would just be no awareness. Her eyes would be open, but if you did this, they would not be drawn to the sound. It was clear that she was awake, but she was not aware. And this is, to give you an example, this is Terry Schiavo. I don't know if this is going to work. So this is Terry Schiavo. She is in the persistent vegetative state. So you see her eyes will open. She's awake, but she's not aware. You speak to her, she's not. There are some basic reflexes. But she can't communicate with you. She's not aware that you're even there. So this is the persistent vegetative state. This is Terry Schiavo. And there's bioethical disputes over the care of individuals in this state as well. Now this is total brain failure, brain death. So you're neither awake, you're not aware. And you're basically in a deep coma because your brain has undergone total brain failure. All right, now, I've said that in the United States and in many other countries, the total brain death is the definition, one of the definitions for death. And we have to talk about why this is the case. And this is a historical narrative. So it begins in 1968 in the report of an ad hoc committee of the Harvard Medical School. So it's a definition of irreversible coma. And so what's interesting in this 1968 document is the following thing. So if you look at the very beginning, the very first statement is, our primary purpose is to define irreversible coma as a new criterion for death. So this is the very first time we have a definition for death. And if you look at the last line, it will tell you why it happened in 1968. Obsolete criteria for the definition of death can lead to controversy in obtaining organs for transplantation. And what is clear is that organ transplantation becomes a possibility at this time, especially the transplantation of the heart, which is why the Harvard ad hoc committee has to sit down and they have to have a conversation about what constitutes death if we are now able to harvest organs for donation. And in terms of the justification, on page 87, the report will say the following. From ancient times down to the recent past, it was clear that when the respiration and heart stopped, the brain would die in a few minutes. In those times, the heart was considered to be the central organ of the body. It is not surprising that its failure marked the onset of death. And what you have here is, you have the identification of an organ, a central organ, the heart, and the idea that the failure of this organ is linked to death. What happens, and this is why I want to highlight that, what happens is, returning now to 1981, and this is where the President's Commission is looking at death. I brought this up earlier. It ceases to constitute an integrated whole, but now it's going to link the brain to this integration. So this is on page 58. The death of a human being, not the death of cells, tissues, or organs, is the matter at issue. The cessation of vital bodily systems provides the basis for broad standards by which death can be judged to have occurred. Although absence of breathing and heartbeat may often have been spoken of as defining death, review of history and of current medical and popular understanding makes clear that these were merely evidence for the disintegration of the organism as a whole. So what you see here is a focus again on disintegration, and that the cessation of breathing and heartbeat are important because they lead to disintegration of the body. Now, what happens is that this same document is going to equate death to brain death for the following reason. After brain death, the body ceases to be an integrated organism and rapidly becomes a disintegrating collection of organs. So you see what's happened here. If you define death as disintegration, and you now see that brain dead people are disintegrating, then you're going to say that brain death is death. Do you understand? That's the rationale that is given in 1981. Death is loss of integration. Total brain death is loss of integration. Therefore, total brain death is death. This is the logic of the 1981 document. And so the Uniform Determination of Death Act, the UDDA, which has become the standard globally for the neurological criteria for death, basically will state the following. An individual who has sustained either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, that's the classical definition, or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem, is dead. This is the law part that basically takes the ideas of the 1968 and 1981 and makes it policy. Okay? And we're going to see that in the last 5 years there was an attempt to revise the UDDA, and that failed. And that's really why we are in the predicament that we are today. So what is the ongoing controversy? It really comes down to this guy. So this is Alan Schumann, and he and I have known each other now for 20 years. In 1998, he publishes a paper on chronic brain death. And he basically lists cases of brain dead individuals who lived a long time. Now remember, brain dead individuals are supposed to be disintegrating corpses. So this challenges that view. So, and he, what he does is 56 out of 175 brain dead patients survive more than a week. And he describes them. And so his challenge is the following. The patient with total brain failure is able to be sustained for long periods of time because he is still an integrated organism, therefore he is still alive. Now, remember, the assumption here made in 1981 is that once you're declared brain dead, your body is falling apart. So if your body is falling apart, then you would not be expected to be hanging out for years. And so if you have brain dead people hanging out for years, you begin to wonder what's going on there. And really, we've spent the last 25 years thinking about what's going on with these individuals who appear to survive and are able to be sustained for many years despite a diagnosis of total brain death. So I'm going to discuss two cases here, very famous one. Two cases. The first is TK, and the second is Yahi McMath. So TK is a long-term total brain death survivor. He was declared brain dead at 4.5 years of age from a meningitis infection in Nebraska. And he is taken home, and his mother takes care of him for 20 years in their basement. Okay? So what happens is he experiences cardiac arrest at age 24 years of age after he was placed on a DNR list. And so a brain-only autopsy was performed, and you see this is his brain, and basically there's nothing in there. So after 20 years of total brain death, it's not surprising that you don't really see any of the typical brain structures that you see. So the question is, if he was totally brain dead and he was allegedly disintegrating, How do you explain the 20 years in his mom's basement? Okay? And the question now is you have to ask, had TK lost this integration? Because this is really the key. Because if he was really dead, then he should not be integrated. Now, he should not have been integrated. So first we need to talk a little bit about what is bodily integration. I usually bring up this example. So a symphonic orchestra is an integrated system. You have all these parts and they're doing stuff together. And the togetherness is greater than the sum of the parts, right? So a Beethoven symphony is not simply just individual instruments. It's all of them playing together. And what happens is that the individual activity of a part, so say a violin, only makes sense in the context of the entire symphonic piece. Why is it that you've got the cymbals, bing, and that's it? He's just standing there for the next 22 minutes, right? And then bing, and if you just looked at that person, if you looked at that one instrument, it makes no sense. But when you see the entire symphony, you see that the intelligibility of that part is based on the activity of the whole. So the whole is what makes sense of the part. And so when you have integrated parts, they're all working for the one purpose of the whole. And I've talked about this as activities of the whole for the whole. So even though the cymbal, the guy with the cymbals, boom, that's all. He has to do it 3 times in the next 2 hours. It's really critical that he do it at exactly the right point. Otherwise, the entire symphony falls apart. That's not the symphony you want to be playing. So you have to understand his part within the context of the symphonic orchestra. So the question that we have to ask is that TK, this 24-year-old young man, did he manifest any activities post-total brain death that suggests that he was still integrated? You understand? We're just going to be looking. And we're going to say integrated in the way that you and I are integrated. And I'm going to suggest there were at least 3. Growing proportionately, mounting an immune response, and maintaining water homeostasis. And hopefully you know that babies are really humans with giant heads, right? So if you look at a baby, it's all head. Now, clearly, if you had a head that big right now, you'd look weird. That's because as you grew, the body proportionately readjusts itself. We actually don't know. I actually looked this up. We really still to this day do not understand how we do this. Okay? But the parts of your body know, okay? When your legs are growing, the left hand is growing, the left arm is growing, the right arm is growing. They have to be growing at the same rate. Otherwise, you're going to be like this. And so there's a coordination amongst all the parts. TK has this. In the 20 years that he was brain dead, it's clear that even though he had an approximate weight of 70 kilograms, remember he's bedridden for 20 years, the extremities were symmetrical. It was proportioned. Immune response, hopefully after COVID, you have a better sense of the immune response. It's a multicellular orchestration of different parts working together to fight off a virus. And it's not just 1 or 2 parts. We're dealing with an army of different cells, different cell types, different molecules, and they're all doing it for the sake of the whole. And what is striking is that TK was also able to mount a robust immune response for most of his life. Occasionally, he would have to get antibiotics, just like you and me. Occasionally, when we get really sick, we get antibiotics. But for the most part, his immune system was able to defend himself against most of the normal bugs that you and I have to deal with. And finally, there's water homeostasis. Have you noticed that you pee multiple times during the day, but at night you don't pee, unless you're like me right now going through jet lag. And I just arrived from the Philippines 3 days ago, so my brain's a little bit weird. And what ends up happening is you're peeing at the weirdest times, because your body doesn't know it's night, And so you don't pee during the day, but you pee during the night, and it's just really strange. And all of this is regulated by different parts of the body, right? And so this is a coordinated system as well. Now, and again, TK was able to maintain his water homeostasis for most of his life. Towards the end, he had diabetes insipidus, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I want to highlight that the 20 years of total brain failure, he was able to do a whole bunch of things that we would expect of an integrated organism, suggesting he's still alive. Okay? We're now going to move to Yahi McMath, much more recent situation. So she's declared brain dead at 13 years of age in California. She's transferred from California to New Jersey because the law in New Jersey has a religious exemption from the neurological determination of death. She's the only human being alive who has two official death certificates, one issued in California and the other one issued in New Jersey, because she eventually dies 5 years later from abdominal complications. But there are a couple of things that we need to talk about again. You know, what sort of integrated activities, if any, did she have? Well, the key for me is that she goes through puberty. So she went through puberty while brain dead. Okay, now, and this is where it's going to get a little bit complicated because I said while brain dead. In other words, she met the requirements for the clinical test for brain death. And the question now is whether or not there's a problem with that clinical criteria. So she goes through puberty. She actually has 2 periods during the portion of her life where she was brain dead. And what is so striking too is that she's still appears to be able to respond to commands. And this is what is so striking about Yahi. So this is why we struggled so much earlier, because I wanted you to see. So this is her mother, and her mother is talking to her and asking her to move her arm. And so you see that arm is moving. And now she goes, come on, Yahi, let's do it better. Let's do it better. Let's do it better. Can you do it again? Let's do it again. And you'll see in a few minutes. And she just keeps saying, come on, Yahi, just do it one more time. We just need to see it one more time. Just move your hand one more time. And what you see here is it appears that this brain dead individual is able to respond to commands. Okay? Not surprisingly, this caused enormous controversy amongst bioethicists at the time of that it happened. And what's really interesting is that, we also have to highlight that there is no doubt that she meets the clinical criteria for total brain death. So the question has arisen now as to whether or not is it the conceptual framework that's a problem, or is it the clinical tests that's a problem? Something's a problem for someone like Yahi to pass those tests and appear to have the activity that she does. Now, this is Arthur Kaplan, who was at Penn. I think he's still at Penn. So in 2014, he says, he's trying to defend the total brain death criteria, Yahi's new doctors are trying to ventilate and otherwise treat a corpse. She's going to start to decompose. This does not happen for 5 years. Okay? And this is where you see the controversy, because you have individuals who appear to pass the test but are not disintegrating. So, in my view, and I'm still in the minority, the data suggests that both TK and Yahi were severely disabled patients. They were not corpses, they were not dead. Because dead individuals do not go through puberty. You also have examples of total brain dead individuals gestating a pregnancy for 3 or 4 months. Again, for women who've had babies, this is a whole body thing. It's not just your uterus that's gestating the baby. the entire body is working together as an integrated system. So these are the examples that raise the questions. So there are Catholic moral theologians, scientists, bioethicists, and their secular counterparts who have raised objections against Schumann's challenge. So I want to show you the other side. One, and I'm going to highlight here, in 2008, the President's Council of Bioethics publishes a white paper on death. So Nicholas Tonti-Filippini was a bioethicist, a Catholic bioethicist, and he basically says that totally brain-dead individuals are actually not totally brain-dead. And the reason he gives for this is the absence of diabetes insipidus. And diabetes insipidus occurs when your hypothalamus, which is a part of your brain, fails. And the fact that patients who are declared brain dead, for many of them, do not have diabetes insipidus, suggests that the criteria may not be able to detect total brain failure. Okay, and so what happens is that Yahi McMath clearly meets the criteria. So either you're going to have to change the criteria, or you're going to have to say that meeting this criteria, regardless of what happens, is equal to death. The second, and so you're going to see, and we're going to deal with this shortly, the question arises as to whether or not the clinical practice guidelines for total brain death should be revised. The second objection is that Schumann's patients were not integrated. So they look integrated, but they're not really integrated. So this is Maureen Kondik, a friend of mine. She puts it this way. She goes, loss of the brain cripples the integration of the immune system. What remains is a coordinated but not integrated system. And I was like, Maureen, what's the difference between a coordinated versus an integrated system? And now, she says, well, they're just different. And we've been debating for years about how you distinguish the two. But then I point out this, right? If you say that the immune system is not integrated, coordinated, you have to say that it's less than ideal. Do you understand? Because the integrated immune system is what it should be. So if it's not integrated, even though it's coordinated, it should be less than ideal. So we should be able to see that. Do patients, brain-dead patients, manifest immune deficiencies of any kind, suggesting that the immune system is not integrated yet still coordinated? And is there any immune dysfunction that you see? And there is no evidence of gross immune dysfunction. So, putting aside the quibbling over the words, it's the way that I've responded to Maureen is I've said, whatever it is, whether it's integrated or coordinated, it looks like my immune system. So however you are yours, right? So however you want to call my system, it looks like my system. So this is the way you get away from the disputes over the words. Now, what's also striking is that the President's Council on Bioethics in 2008 agrees that brain-dead patients, even if they fulfill the criteria, remain integrated. It would be difficult to deny that the body of a patient with total brain failure can still be alive, at least in some cases. And if you look at the beginning, if being alive means a whole more than the mere sum of the parts, so integration. So here you've got the President's Council of Bioethics agreeing that you still see integration, at least in some cases. So what next? There are 4 options, and we're basically struggling because we're all we're stuck trying to figure out which one of these we want to do. So the first one is you replace the total brain death with another criterion for death. So this is 2014, and this is just a paradigmatic article. What you're seeing here, this is Robert Turog at Harvard and Franklin Miller. They want to replace biological death with legal death. And the analogy they would get is we have biological blindness and we have legal blindness. So why don't we have biological death and legal death? When my students will say, well, what do you say? I said, well, you're killing people. So you see, because we have a dead donor rule. So there's a dead donor rule in bioethics, regardless if it's Catholic or secular. Basically says that organs have to be harvested from dead people. So harvesting a heart from a legally dead donor who is biologically alive would be tantamount to killing that person, you see? And regardless, again, of what you call it. Again, there's a lot of words. You have to understand what's the underlying reality. And I point out, not only would this be killing, what would happen is that it would radically undermine our efforts to increase organ donation because people would be scared that you would kill them, you see? And so they're not going to go and they're not going to list themselves as organ donors because they're worried that if there's any hint that they could get you would get their organs, you would do it. That's number one. So the second one is you change the conceptual basis for total brain death. What happens here is this is what the President's Council of Bioethics does. So remember, in 1981, the President's Commission says loss of integration is death. Remember that? That's the conceptual basis. So now we're going to change that. We're going to say determining whether an organism remains a whole depends on recognizing the persistence or cessation of the fundamental vital work of a living organism. And what kind of work is that? So total brain failure can continue to serve as a criterion for declaring death. And notice the change, not because it necessarily indicates a complete loss of integrated somatic functioning. That's what the 1981 document wanted to say. In 2008, we're going to change the definition because it is a sign that this organism can no longer engage in the essential work that defines living things. So you see they're switching the terminology. And so what is the work? No signs of consciousness. And if there are no signs of consciousness, and if the spontaneous breathing is absent, and if the best clinical judgment is that these neurological facts cannot be reversed, our argument would lead us to conclude that a once living patient has now died. So you're now moving away from integration to a work argument. And so here my objections, and they're objections not just of myself, but many of my Catholic colleagues. Why is maintaining bodily homeostasis not a vital work for a living organism while spontaneous breathing is? You see, so it seems arbitrary. Okay, you're breathing, I'm doing my vital work, but when I'm sleeping and my body has to be integrated, I've got to stay the right temperature and I have to pee at the right time, that's not vital work, you see? And so now we want a rationale for that. Second one, if a patient with total brain failure is truly dead because he lacks the vital work of the organism, then how does one explain the integration that remains after he has died? So the integration is still there, but not the work. The question now is, why is the integration still there? Because classically understood, the integration was, well, in the philosophical tradition, the work of the soul. And that was why you had to look for disintegration, because that's what signaled the loss of the soul. So now we're going to say there's a soul there, but that soul is not doing its work. See, it's integrating, but not doing it. So there are conceptual challenges with that. And then, of course, what about the fetal child who is not breathing? Is he dead in utero? So these are arguments that have been raised against the President's Council. What's striking is that in 2024, this is already passé. Most people are not talking about this anymore. We're now the next thing, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because for Catholic bioethicists, this has been the way to go. We will revise the clinical criteria for total brain death. Remember, Yahi McMath met all the criteria, but she seemed to be doing things the dead people are not supposed to be doing. So we can either say she's so what we will say is, it's not that she is brain dead. The clinical criteria are insufficient to ensure that you can determine whether or not a person is brain dead. So we're going to revise the clinical criteria. And what's going to happen now, and you see this in the last 5 years, is it's acknowledged that up to 50% of patients who are declared dead by neurological criteria have preserved hypothalamic function. Now, hypothalamic, that's the hypothalamus, that's one of the parts of the brain that is involved in regulation of water control, some of the basic functions of your body. And central diabetes insipidus, this is a instability of your body's homeostasis because of the absence of the hypothalamus. So what has happened now, and you see this, this is a 2023 debate in the journal Neurology, which is the foremost journal in English in neurology, is that there is a debate over whether or not we should add loss of hypothalamic function to the criteria required to diagnose total brain death. So I mentioned that there were these criteria. I did not list them. But the debate now is, should we not just add an additional criteria to make sure that the hormonal activity of the brain through the hypothalamus is completely obliterated? Okay? And you see there is a debate. Yes on the left, right on the no on the right. This is also the strategy of Daniel Somasi. So Daniel Somasi is a prominent Catholic bioethicist down at Georgetown. And this is a paper that was published 3 or 4 months ago. And again, he is trying to save the brain death criteria. So what he's saying now is, if you read this paper, he says basically 2 things. One, he will say the brain is not the central integrating organ. And 2, but we are still going to add the diabetes insipidus as a criteria, because once that happens, basically the brain, the body starts to fall apart. So, and this is the hypothalamus. So it's at the really core part of the brain. So this is what Daniel Somasi and individuals of like-minded individuals will say. Without treatment, total brain failure, including loss of all hypothalamic function, would lead to certain death, suggesting that the body is disintegrating. Remember, again, we're focusing here on integration because these are scholars who are attempting to save the integration criteria of brain death. Thus, total brain death, including total loss of hypothalamic function, has triggered loss of bodily integrity. Therefore, it is death. You see the argument? This is the argument that is being made now. And Daniel is, as a Catholic bioethicist, is proposing this in a sense to try to fill in that hole. But here's the question I have, right? But why loss of the hypothalamus, which secretes vasopressin, rather than, say, loss of the adrenal glands, which secretes cortisol? So the adrenal glands are glands, right, that sit above your kidney. If you lose them, you go through what's called adrenal crisis and you die. So doctors have to go in there. It's an emergency. Because again, vasopressin and cortisol are hormones that are involved in regulating body-wide homeostasis. So again, I can take Daniel Somasi's argument and just replace one word, right? Without treatment, total brain failure, including loss of adrenal function, would also lead to certain death, suggesting that the body is disintegrating. Therefore, total brain failure, including total loss of adrenal function, not hypothalamic function, adrenal function has triggered loss of bodily integrity. So this is death also. See, so I'm proposing that using the logic of identifying the hypothalamus as the last crucial bit that has to be lost in order for you to be totally dead because of loss of bodily integrity, we can replace that with the adrenal cortex and it has the same result. Now, so why does Daniel privilege the hypothalamus over the adrenal, because it goes back to this idea that the brain is the central integrator of the body. The hypothalamus is part of the brain. The adrenal cortex is not. That's basically the difference. They both secrete important hormones. And so if you lose one or both, you die. Here's the question. Do you really need a central integrator of the body? And this is really the heart of the debate. And what's interesting is that this is from the other side, the beginning of life. This is a paper from Magdalena Zernicka-Goetz's lab at the University of Cambridge. It's very clear that at least when we test it in the earliest stages of human life, early human embryos do not have an organ that integrates the body. It's called the principle of self-organization. Basically, you can take, there's no critical part of that embryo that you can remove that the embryo collapses. The embryo is able to kind of self-regulate itself. So you don't need an organ at the central organ at the beginning of your life. The question is, why do we say, therefore, that you need it at the end of your life? Because you see, it could be that several overlapping systems maintain bodily integration. So it's not just one, but there are multiple systems, there's redundancy. Biology, if you look at biological systems, evolution loves redundancy, because if you lose one, you're dead. Well, if you have a backup, you're still alive to have more kids. So what ends up happening in a very simplistic sense is you expect redundancy, actually, biologically. So here, the view is that rather than say there's a single organ, why don't we just say, and the more likely view is that there are actually redundant systems. And so when you get rid of the brain and then you get rid of the adrenal cortex, you have two systems that are regulating the integrity. You can begin to lose one and you can still maintain integrity. But when you start losing several, the whole thing collapses. And you see this in architecture, you see this in engineering as well. And basically I want to highlight is that if you revise the clinical criteria to include hypothalamic function, you justify moving from death by neurological criteria to death by integrative criteria, which is what I'm proposing. You don't have one organ, the brain, but you've got multiple overlapping ones. So the last is retain the status quo, and that's what happened. So the last 5 years, there was an attempt to revise the Uniform Determination of Death Act. It was unsuccessful. The committee just said, we will come back to it, but we won't tell you when we'll come back to it. Everyone just says they'll never go back to it. It's done. And you can see why, because there's this fundamental disagreement at multiple levels over what is death, how to count death, and there are a lot of people who are like, well, it's all about organs. So the danger is that if we revise the UDDA, we will actually decrease the number of organs that are available. So there are many, many competing parties in this debate. I'm going to end here by just talking about returning to the pulmonary circulatory definition for death. This is the classical view. Your heart stops, you stop breathing, you're dead. The question now is, can we use this in the 21st century in an effort to also recover organs for transplantation? And so here the definition of death is the classical view, the loss of bodily integration caused by the permanent cessation of circulation and respiration. This is the way we've been doing this. People have been acknowledging death for a long time. And this is a study in 2000 where they started looking at what is called the Lazarus effect. So when your heart stops, how long do you have to wait before we know it will never start again? Spontaneously, okay? Because remember, if we're looking at death, how long do we wait? So your heart stops. Are you really dead then? Do we have to wait 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 6 minutes? And so a consensus appeared in 2000 for 5 minutes, okay? So a patient can be declared dead 5 minutes after the heart stops, which is more than twice the maximum time observed for a Lazarus effect. Just last year, so in 2023, there was a systematic review published to discuss the experience of the Canadian healthcare system for the last 20 years. And it basically confirms that in controlled circulatory cessation of circulation and breathing, there is 5 minutes is enough to guarantee that there will be no Lazarus effect. So that the idea here is that we would wait until you would be on a DNR. So then we would then withdraw. You're ventilated. We deem the ventilation or intubation to be extraordinary means. I have no time to go into the categories for that. We can now therefore withdraw without killing you. We allow you to die. Your heart stops. We wait for 5 minutes. And at that point, we would be able to obtain your organs if you had given consent prior to the procedure. And so the question I'm going to end here is, should we therefore return to pulmonary circulatory criteria for death after 40 years of the total brain death criteria, only because it's become so confusing? So for my conclusions, you can see historically the neurological criteria for death were grounded in an account of integration of the human organism, and that Alan Schumann basically shows empirical data that there were totally brain dead patients who were clearly not disintegrating. Proposals to move beyond biological death, and there are many of them in the literature today, would be ethically troubling and problematic, because basically you'd be violating the dead donor rule, and you'd be removing hearts from people who are not yet dead. And then this is the proposal, is that the neurological criteria for death should be replaced by circulatory criteria. The classical view, but now set up so organ donation can happen, right? So you have this 5-minute rule. So this is where we are at. There's a lot of disputes going on, and I just wanted to give you an overview. For acknowledgements, Alan and I have been talking about this for 20 years, and there was a symposium on the definition of death at CUA in 2014 when we started talking about this, and they really helped me, my friends and my colleagues there helped me to kind of frame what I've talked up to you about today. In the 10 years since then, it's gotten more controversial, and it's just you can see that the abandonment of the revision of the UDDA was quite traumatic for the medical community. And what you're seeing now is that individual societies are trying to figure out on their own if they're going to change the rules. And so what's going to happen is you've got a hodgepodge of rules everywhere. All right, thank you very much for your kind attention. Any questions?